This is Lisa from MobileTechReview, and this is the 2018 15-inch MacBook Pro, which looks physically identical to the 2016 and 2017 15-inch MacBook Pro. So no casing redesign here. What does that mean? If you didn't like the 2016 and 2017's compromises for the super thin and light design, it's 4.02 pounds, which is 1.87 kilograms, and 15.5 millimeters thin, which makes even a 15-inch razor blade look kind of chunky. Well, you still have dongle hell. You've got 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports. That's great if you have a lot of Thunderbolt 3 accessories or you use a Thunderbolt 3 dock at your desk, but otherwise, dongle hell for you. And obviously we have the butterfly keyboard here, which seems to be a love it or hate it. I'm more towards the hate it kind of thing. Almost no travel. So it's the 3rd generation of that keyboard, though. What does that mean? They have put little silicone baffles under each key, sort of like little condoms. Now, Apple says that's to make the keys quieter because they were awfully clacky despite the fact they had very little travel. And it is effective. They are a little less clacky. It's still noisy, but it's not like, God, yeah, I'm annoyed by it, noisy. But it also, that silicone barrier really bears a striking resemblance to their patented dust ingress protection system. So maybe it'll help with the problem that they've been having with the butterfly keyboards, where just the itziest little specks of dust can sometimes make your keys misbehave. The strong points are it's a gorgeous looking laptop. It's extremely well made. It's very rigid. The display, yeah, it's not 4K, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. It's still one of the nicest you're going to find on a laptop in terms of color accuracy, and a lot of that has to do with the operating system. It's delightful. Of course, there's no touchscreen. We still have the touch bar, which some people derisively call the emoji bar. I still don't find it terribly useful. About the thing I like most about it is scrubbing inside of Final Cut Pro or when playing a YouTube video, something like that. Yeah, it's still a long reach over the keyboard just to do something you could hit a command key to do instead. The other great thing is that we have Intel 8th generation 6-core Coffee Lake CPUs. That's the 45-watt kind of CPU that you'd expect to see in mobile workstation level laptops, and not too far behind the Windows counterparts by about 2 months or so afterwards for Apple. That's actually pretty good. So a lot more potential processing power, a lot more potential heat. I have a really good trick for that that doesn't involve throwing it in the freezer. We're going to look at it now. So let's talk about pricing and why the Mac tax perhaps is actually worse than it used to be. Yeah, you can say that the prices now are pretty much the same that they have been for, 4 years, 5 years or so. But here's the thing. My 2012 era 15-inch MacBook Pro was $2,500 with a dedicated graphics option, but at the time you got 16 gigs of RAM and a 512 gig SSD. Now back in 2012, it was like, what am I going to do with all that RAM almost? And that's a huge SSD given the fact that they're so expensive. Well, now fast forward from 2012 to 2018, and you're still getting 16 gigs of RAM and a 512 gig SSD. So part of the justification for the high price before was that you were getting kind of those upgrades already built in. That's not the case anymore. The other problem is that Apple charges a lot for all those upgrades. You can say that the base prices are kind of like the way they've been, and I can live with that. And if you're good with the base product specs, which are decent, they're okay, then good for you. But otherwise, say you want that Core i9 because Intel has everybody captivated with the idea of having a Core i9. It is not so great, the Core i9. We'll talk about that. Anyway, that's $400 more. You want to go and get that 32 gigs of RAM? That's $400 more. You want to get it with a 1 terabyte SSD, just the Core i7 mid-range model, and 32 gigs of RAM, and you're talking $3,700. That's beyond the Mac tax. It's getting a little bit... So, hopefully, the base models are more suited to you. The introductory level model, shall we call it, has a 2.2 gigahertz Core i7-8750H processor, which we see in a lot of Windows laptops right now. Turbo boost goes up to 4.1 gigahertz, 16 gigs of RAM, a 256 gig SSD, which is really, I think, insulting for $2,400, and for pro users, that's just not going to cut it for a lot of us. And you get the AMD Radeon Pro 555X dedicated GPU. The X is new for this model year, and it's just a slight boost in clock speed, nothing much to see here in terms of performance, which is a shame because dedicated graphics are where the Mac has been lacking, because what they're trying to do is keep the charging requirement low, under 100 watts, and to not make much heat and much noise. So it is a 35-watt GPU, and in that respect, it's actually pretty impressive, the amount of performance that it does give you compared to an NVIDIA graphics card using a lot more power and generating more heat. If you go up one level, the other pre-built option is $2,700. That one has a Core i7-8850H, and that is clocked at 2.6 gigahertz. So that's a nice jump from 2.2 to 2.6. I would recommend that. That also gets you the Radeon Pro 560X. So that's another move up. I'd also recommend that. Either way, you're going to get 4 gigabytes of GDDR5 VRAM, so you're not going to increase your VRAM. You're going to get 16 gigs of RAM still and a 512 gig SSD, which is kind of a good amount of room to have, at least as a minimum, for somebody who is a pro user. Now, I will say that that $2,700 model, which is kind of the sweet spot of where I'd go, I can live with 16 and not 32 gigs of RAM. That's okay with me. The fact that that's a couple of $100 more than the equivalent Razer Blade 15 is kind of shocking. You know what I mean? You get Razer Blade 15 was expensive. Well, this kind of blows it away by several $100s. All right, now we've gotten pricing out of the way, and the fact that obviously if you wanted to configure this with a terabyte SSD and 32 gigs of RAM, you could almost get 2 Dell XPS 15s for the price. Let's look at what else we have here. First off, you can get it with a 4 terabyte SSD, which is a first. I don't believe there's any other laptop that has that option right now. And God bless you if you can afford that, because that's $2,800 additional. I think most of us will go with external storage, but if you can afford it, take me out to dinner. We finally have DDR4 RAM. Before, Apple was still using DDR3 when everybody else was using DDR4, and they said, oh, because DDR4 uses more power. It's a 15-minute difference in overall runtime. So finally, they moved to DDR4, and they slightly increased battery capacity to compensate for that. So battery runtimes are about the same as they were before. So that's pretty good stuff right there. You do get a performance boost from having DDR4, certainly. The SSDs in this now, here you go. This is how some people can be fooled by things. So you can see our Blackmagic test here, and those are very good speeds. Yes, they are. But a Samsung 970 Evo drive can also achieve those speeds. Say, put it in a Razer Blade 15, give it a test, which I've done, put a 1 terabyte Evo 970 in my Razer Blade 15, and it'll achieve the same things. But Apple has some file system optimizations that they've done. So things like file duplications are insanely fast. Why? I don't know. Do we all spend our days duplicating files? Why? Probably because it looks really great on benchmarks. And some reviewers will say, look at how fast those file duplication speeds are. Well, we want to look at the read and write speeds. And you can see they're in line with the best SSDs that are available today, and it's good stuff. By the way, nothing is upgradable here. Nothing. No. You can unscrew the bottom. You can unscrew those Pentalow proprietary screws and take it off and say, that's a very beautiful, clean design. But other than that, the RAM is soldered on. The SSD is soldered on. It's chips. It's not a M.2 slotted thingy at all. The Wi-Fi is soldered on. Everything is soldered on here. The battery is that interesting thing that Apple does with multiple chunks of battery cells glued to the top casing. Not easy to get out. So this is sort of like a Surface Book sort of experience. Don't expect to upgrade anything. Don't expect to service this one yourself. Except the trackpad. That's pretty easy to take out. We do have the new Apple T2 chip in here, replacing the T1, and that handles your Touch ID, your touch bar, and encryption, including file system encryption, and speeds those up. So that's a good thing. And Touch ID is still here, your fingerprint scanner. That's a nice thing. I do hope they move on to Face ID. That would be certainly lovely. Obviously, it works great on the iPhone. They could hopefully do that someday. Meanwhile, we still have the 720p webcam, or FaceTime camera, as they call it, up top above the display. The trackpad is still humongous. I still don't know why, but it's nice. It works very well. We still have Force Touch if you're into that sort of thing, and I don't have any problems with palm rejection on it. The keyboard, like I said, it is quieter, and I appreciate that. It also feels slightly more tactile and crisp, whereas I really didn't like the first and second generation ones. I can kind of live with this. I'm not in love with it. Maybe we've also gotten used to the thinner and thinner laptops with more and more compromised keyboards in terms of travel. It feels a lot like the Dell XPS 15 2-in-1 with the maglev keyboard, which isn't such a bad thing. It's weird, but I can live with it. The display on this is lovely still. 2880 by 1800. No, it's not 4K. I really am okay with that in the 15-inch size. My eyeballs really can't see the difference between 4K resolution or not. 16 by 10 aspect ratio. In terms of color gamut, it covers P3, which isn't really the most useful thing unless you're creating feature films, where P3 is the color space that's used. We mostly care about sRGB and Adobe RGB. Those coverages are excellent. 91% of Adobe RGB, swing, you're right up there with Dell XPS 15, 4K display, and all that sort of thing. The contrast is excellent on this. It's wonderful. What makes it more wonderful are two things. First off, color management. Mac OS itself does color management, which Windows 10 still does not. They're working on that, Microsoft is. So that means if you have a high gamut display, if you're just tooling around the operating system or any program that's not color managed, which means pretty much anything except for Adobe CC suite of apps, colors can look garish or not very realistic. So Apple takes care of that. So it's just a gorgeous looking but somehow natural display. Also, they do scaling really well at the operating system level. It's not up to the application really to support it. Apple's operating system handles that. So while Windows 10 has made great strides and we don't see as many programs with teeny tiny impossible to read text on high resolution displays, never a problem with the Mac. It's well done. By the way, it can support two 5K external displays at 60 Hz or four 4K displays at 60 Hz. So that's pretty good. And we now have True Tone, something that we saw on the iPad Pro, which means it looks at the ambient light and say it's a kind of darkish room at night, you're by the couch, whatever, and it will warm the display. I really personally like that. I like color accurate displays, and you really notice blue-white looking displays looking really much worse in dark lighting. So if you like that, that's a great thing. It's there for you. It is easier on the eyes, less blue light at night. You get the idea, or in dark rooms. Now Windows 10 has something sort of similar. They have their night light feature, and that can turn on the schedule. So sunset to sunrise, for example. That one gives you a slider, so there's no automatic adjustment, but then again, you have control over it. If you want it not too yellow, you can still do that. The display is glossy, however, it has just about the least glare you're going to see on a glossy display. Apple does a good job with that, and hopefully, unlike some previous generation models, the coating on there will last a little bit longer. Some people have problems with the coating staining or peeling, that sort of thing. Hopefully that's a thing of the past now. All right, performance and cooling. I know this is what you guys and gals are really waiting for. First off, let's talk about the Core i9 for a minute. And I've said this in my Windows laptop reviews, and we've reviewed a few like the Alienware 17R5 that have the Core i9 8950H CPU or HK. And it's a marketing thing from Intel. Really, this is equivalent, the Core i9, to last generation, 7th generation, top-of-the-line Core i7 CPU overclockable, so the 7820HK, for example. It's the same architecture as the Core i7. It's the same 6 cores and 12 threads. It has more cache, faster cache. That's about it. So it's not as big a deal as you might think because Intel decided to give it a whole different name for marketing reasons. So there. It does make more heat, though, because it has higher base clock speeds. So where you're talking 2.2 or 2.6 gigahertz for the Core i7 models, this one is 2.9 gigahertz. When it comes to turbo boost, we go from 4.1 gigahertz to 4.3 gigahertz to 4.8 gigahertz for the Core i9. But the Mac doesn't spend much time in turbo boost. I have done a bunch of tests. I have done Final Cut Pro tests, benchmarking tests, exporting video with Handbrake kind of tests, and it's not boosting a whole lot. So I'm more interested in the base clock speeds because that's where it's going to be spending a lot of its time. Why is it not turbo boosting? Because this laptop is too thin and doesn't have adequate cooling to run it at higher clock speeds. Doing the same Handbrake export where I take a 4K, I actually generate an iPhone video and export it to a 1080p H.265 video, which uses the CPU, not the GPU. It's about 1.5 minutes slower than the Razer Blade 15 or even the Dell G7, which is their low-end gaming laptop with a Core i7-8750 inside, to give you an example. It just doesn't have the cooling, folks. The good news is you can overcome this in part. Now, you don't put it in the freezer or move to Siberia, right? That's silly, gimmicky things. What you can do is actually override the fan control. I've been using Macs for like 20 years on and off, and the laptops tend to run hot. And Apple wants to make a quiet laptop. So you can say, oh, we make the quietest laptops and it's less hot to touch. That is true, actually. The bottom on this gets warm, but it doesn't get frying an egg hot like a Razer Blade will, or even Dell XPS 15 that's pushed hard. but they run the fans too slow. They don't ramp them up soon enough or fast enough. So it used to be SMC Fan Control was the app to go to, but that one's not really supported anymore under High Sierra. So you can get something called Max Fan Control. Just download it, install it, and you can override the default behavior. You will hear more fan noise, but no matter what with this thing does not get loud. This is not like a 2012 era Mac. It just cannot scream. It cannot make so much noise. It's totally worth it. Use that. Change the fan control. So I have it starting to boost up when the CPU hits 65 centigrade, the cores. And then I have it really ramp up when it hits about 82 degrees. And it makes a difference in terms of core temperatures. So doing that handbrake export or using Blender, which, boy, Blender on a Mac is not a good thing in terms of cores performance and CPU temperatures hitting 99. Yeah, it'll drop between 5 and 10 degrees centigrade on the cores, which means it will spend more time at least its base clock speed and turbo boosting more. So that's your practical way of handling the heat here. No matter what you do, this is still not going to run, say, when I'm doing that handbrake export that I was talking about, or even Blender. Now, you'll see the Razer Blade spend most of its time, as an example, at 3.3 gigahertz for all cores. The Mac will spend most of its time bouncing around a lot, but going anywhere from 2.2 to sometimes 3 gigahertz and more down in the 2 point something or other. So it's not going to run as well as a more thoroughly cooled PC laptop, especially one that's oriented towards gaming. Sorry about that. When it comes to the Dell XPS 15, latest generation for 2018, that one's thermally constrained too. Just like Apple, they really haven't redesigned the cooling system, and going from 4 to 6 cores has generated a lot more heat. So Apple is not alone for not compensating for this very well in terms of cooling and having some problems. They're all running hot. The Razer Blade 15 R5, latest generation with the Core i9, that hits 96 degrees centigrade when gaming. 100 degrees is the allowable maximum. So Apple's not alone in having this problem, but the way they're dealing with it is they're having the CPU not really boost very much. So what does all this mean? Well, if you're somebody who is not just buying this because they want a big screen and a nice Mac, and you really are using this for pro apps and pushing it hard, definitely use Max Fan Control and control your fan speeds. If you're a Mac lover, you're going to be willing to give up some performance relative to a Windows laptop. So if you're cool with that, pun intended, then it's okay. Final Cut Pro, very well optimized for the Mac. Apple makes it. It's not a problem. Running that, as you saw on screen, even without manually controlling the fans, the temperatures are okay on that, and they can be absolutely great if you micromanage the fans yourself. But as always, this is a laptop whose selling points are it's not as loud as competing laptops, and it doesn't get as hot on the bottom, but you're sacrificing some performance in the end. In terms of gaming, this is not a gaming laptop. Apple pretty much makes that clear. This is not a gaming laptop. This is not really a great gaming GPU sort of thing. The 560X is about equivalent to a GTX 1050. The other challenge is games are not as well optimized, honestly, for AMD as for NVIDIA GPUs. The other thing that's not very well optimized is Adobe Premiere Pro. That's why I don't even run that test. For years now, Adobe Premiere Pro runs like a dog on the Mac. It's just not optimized for that. There's not much of a point. If you live in Adobe Premiere, you should be buying a Windows laptop. If you live in Final Cut, which I think a lot of you are, it's one of the selling points, you're hooked on Final Cut, then you should be using a Mac, which is wicked fast and well optimized. So back to gaming again. We're not going to demo a lot of gaming footage because it just doesn't do well, but I have run Fortnite, and you can see it's a little disappointing, even though it's not a gaming laptop at this price range. Really, you can't run Fortnite on high settings. 35 to 38 frames per second doesn't cut it. But if you put it on medium, you've got a solid 60 frames per second on them. Now, I don't run Windows benchmarks and Windows gaming because, number one, every time Apple comes out with a new laptop, they don't have the boot camp drivers ready. Number two, the boot camp drivers are not nearly as well optimized as Mac OS drivers, so it's just not going to do as well. You're not going to be able to use integrated graphics, for example, to test out heat and all that sort of thing. So, yeah. When it comes to battery life, it's just like the last gen, which is to say actually pretty good for this class of machine, and about 8 hours, I find, with moderate use. Some Photoshop, obviously streaming some Netflix, who can resist that sort of thing, doing productivity work. If you're going to be doing Final Cut Pro or playing Fortnite, surely it will be shorter battery life. They've slightly increased battery capacity now. Like I said, it's 83.7 watts inside, watt hours, just to compensate for the DDR4 RAM. Charger is the same, 87 watt charger. The nice thing is you're under that 100 watt limit for Thunderbolt 3 charging, so Thunderbolt 3 docks, all that sort of thing, can charge it. And you still now have to pay extra for the extension cord, the one that goes, you know, you yank off your little prongs here and you want to get a longer cord for it, you have to pay extra. It's not in the box anymore. So that's the 2018 15-inch MacBook Pro. As ever with MacBook Pros, it seems to be a love it or hate it kind of thing. People have strong opinions either way. Some of them are like, whatever Apple does, I love them. Other people are going to deride it no matter how good it is. And the truth is, it's still somewhere in between. You cannot call this junk. You can call this expensive for the price. Certainly it is, especially when you add those upgrades on, which is where the real problems amplify the whole situation here. But you get a very stable operating system, and typically OS updates don't wreak quite as much havoc still as the Windows counterparts. You get one of the best displays in the business and color management at the OS level to go with it that really make the display that much more enjoyable. Speakers that are excellent. What is it with Windows laptops lately? I mean, even the gaming ones with their mediocre, no bass, kind of wimpy speakers. I don't know. So, plenty of Thunderbolt 3, it's forward-looking. Still, you can't upgrade this after the fact, and servicing it is a nightmare. So it's a mixed bag. It's fast, it's beautiful, it gets less physically hot to the touch than the average laptop in this class, and it certainly is quieter. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more cool tech videos, and thumbs up if you like this vid.